The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 17th of July 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Guy Delaunay. Coming up on today's programme, we're at the Republican Party convention in Milwaukee, where the coronation of Donald Trump is in full flow.
Donald Trump has my strong endorsement, period.
Also, don't be put off by the film Under Paris. It really is safe to swim in the Seine. Monocle's Claudia Jacob will be telling us how. Google, Amazon and Project Nimbus will be hearing all about the links between US big tech and the Israel Defense Forces. Plus, Monocle's senior correspondent Fernando Augusto Pacheco will be rounding up the latest from Brazil. What have you got for us, Fernando?
Hello, Guy. Today is a bit of an airport special. We look at the airport wars in Rio de Janeiro and the reopening of a major airport in southern Brazil.
We'll look forward to that, plus a roundup of the latest business news here on The Briefing with me, Guy Delaunay. Now, Donald Trump almost certainly doesn't need an endorsement from Liz Truss, but he got one anyway at the Republican Party convention in Milwaukee. Britain's shortest-serving Prime Minister was just one of a slew of admirers, allies and former foes who queued up to pay obeisance, and there's likely to be more of the same today. For more, I'm joined now from Milwaukee by the journalist H.J. Mai. Welcome to The Briefing, H.J. Is that how you saw it?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that line. And by the way, nice writing by the Guardian there. I like that. I would agree with that. As you already played a clip of Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley endorsed him, one of his, or actually his biggest primary opponent in this election cycle. I mean, he got the endorsement of Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor. And yes, there's definitely a show of unity within the Republican Party. That unity doesn't extend to the Democrats, but there's a show of unity, and especially I would say after, what happened over the weekend, the assassination attempt on the former president, has made this really a celebration of the former president and his MAGA, his Make America Great movement.
I haven't seen the video of Nikki Haley speaking. From that clip, it sounded like something you'd hear in a hostage video, somebody saying they didn't quite believe in. Is that an unfair characterization of Nikki Haley, or do you think she really has enthusiastically embraced all things Trump?
I think it's hard to say. I think for her, it's about, considering her political future and, given where the Republican Party is going, that, you have to embrace at the moment the MAGA movement. I think it was just, for her political future, for her survival. I'm not sure that she really believes that Trump, is the best person to be put back in the White House. So I'm not disagreeing with your assessment that this might have been forced, but, it's just the way the Republican Party is operating at the moment. So I think, for her political future, for the future of the Republicans winning the White House in November, it was just necessary. And you might know that she initially was not invited to be here. And then after she released her delegates that she won during the primary, after the assassination attempt, the party came around and actually gave her those couple minutes on stage to endorse the former president.
A couple of highlights from things that Nikki Haley has previously said. She called Trump unhinged and diminished, saying he was not the same person he was in 2016. Of course, J.D. Vance wants to describe Mr. Trump as America's Hitler, and now he's going to be addressing the convention today as Donald Trump's running mate.
Yeah, exactly. He will speak later tonight, and that will be the focus of today. The theme of today is international relations and foreign policy. And as you might be aware, that J.D. Vance, who has embraced Donald Trump and MAGA, as you said, after initially being an anti-Trump person, he is expected to call on the U.S. to stop its, foreign interventions, to take a step back in its leadership role, especially when it comes to Europe, and focus on Asia. And so I think especially a lot of friends in Europe and in the UK will be interested in what he has to say tonight.
Indeed. We've already seen a lot of people, a lot of diplomats saying off the record that the choice of J.D. Vance is bad news for Europe.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, given what he said in the past, his past statements, have made that clear. He wants, as I mentioned, less interference in foreign wars, especially. He has called on a peace treaty between Moscow and Kyiv and end the war in Ukraine. He doesn't want to give any more money to Ukraine. And just like everybody else in U.S. politics at the moment, his main concern is really China. Europe is not his main concern anymore.
We've seen in the Republican Party and over the days of this convention, but consistently really over the past 8 years now, there's very little dissent. There's very little in the way of people speaking out on how the party should be, on how American politics should be, anything other than the Donald Trump way. Are there any dissenting voices that you're hearing at the convention this year?
No, not here in Milwaukee, not over those, over this week here. This is really a peaceful and almost like jovial atmosphere. It's really a celebration of Donald Trump, of his movement that he created when he came down the escalator back in 2015 and announced his initial run for presidency. And there's no dissenting voice. I mean, all those people, that you would call, those elite Republicans or establishment Republicans, they're not here. I mean, you mentioned there are people like Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, a former presidential candidate. None of them are here. Even his former vice president Mike Pence is not here. He has not been invited. And so no, there's no dissenting voice within this convention this year.
I mean, bearing in mind that Donald Trump is 78, what future is there for the Republican Party beyond Mr. Trump? How does it move on? Whatever happens in the election in November, Donald Trump is going to have a finite run as the defining figure of the party. But what's the direction of travel? Does it end with Mr. Trump, or is there some coherent way of going forward once he's no longer this defining figure?
Well, I think, a lot of people, after he lost in 2020, a lot of people thought that maybe, the Republican Party is finding a new identity, take over a little bit of the MAGA movement, but also, try to find more of a middle ground between, what the Republican Party stood for before he came into power. But I think, by nominating J.D. Vance as his vice presidential candidate, by, really rewriting the party platform pretty much as a MAGA document, he's basically, setting the foundation for, putting his legacy and putting MAGA as part of the future of the Republican Party. And I think, that's why he picked J.D. Vance. That's why his daughter-in-law is the co-chair of the National Republican Committee. I think, he's thinking about his legacy, and especially I think he thinks even more about it after, surviving this assassination attempt. So I think he's laying the groundwork that MAGA, even after, should he win in November, have another 4 years in the White House, and then obviously, he's done theoretically. Who knows if he tries to try to run again. But I think he wants to make sure that what he has built over the past 8 years will live on long, long after his political career is over.
Thank you very much for joining us from Milwaukee. That was H.J. Mai at the Republican National Convention. Now here's Monocle's Carlotta Rebello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Guy. The death toll from anti-tax protests in Kenya has risen to 50, while 413 people have been injured. Youth-led nationwide protests that broke out a month ago against proposed tax hikes have continued, even after President William Ruto withdrew the legislation and fired almost all of his cabinet. Donald Trump says Taiwan should pay the US for protection from China, calling into question Washington's support for the island democracy should he win back the White House in November's presidential election. Taiwan's premier responded by saying Taiwan and the US have good relations, despite the lack of formal ties, and is dedicated to bolstering its defenses. And an agave century plant that blooms only once every 100 years has begun to open its bushy yellow blossoms in Hibiya Park in Tokyo. Locals and foreign tourists are crowding into the park to see and photograph the rare flowers. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Guy.
Thanks very much, Carlotta. Now, if you've seen the film Under Paris, you'll know that the climactic scene features the mayor of the city staging a triathlon in the Seine despite dire warnings about swimmer safety. Well, competitors in the Olympics won't have to brave hungry sharks, but there have been serious concerns about pollution. So, to prove the Seine is swimmable, the real-life mayor, Anne Hidalgo, took a dip herself this morning, with just over a week to go until the start of the Games. And Monocle writer Claudia Jacob has been following the mayoral swim. Claudia, can we say what style she chose to deploy? Was it butterfly, perhaps? Or
I'm not sure, but it was a full wetsuit goggles scenario. It was taken very seriously. I mean, this is really a landmark moment in time for Parisians. I mean, this was a dream for Jacques Chirac back in 1988 and a pledge that Anne Hidalgo made back in January. I don't think she imagined that she would have to leave it quite this late. I mean, this really is like at the 11th hour. You know, the opening ceremony is in 9 days' time. But yeah, up until, about 2 weeks ago, the levels of bacteria were still too high for this to happen. So it does feel sort of miraculous.
And this was important because it's not just that we're going to have the open water swimming event, the triathlon all set, not on but in the Seine, but we're also having the opening ceremony. That's waterborne as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was going to be the first opening ceremony outside of a stadium. And yeah, this is a big deal for Parisians. This is, as good an opportunity for nation branding as you're really going to get. So to take opportunities like being able to clean up such a historic and important body of water in Paris. I mean, the Seine borders 10 of Paris's 20 arrondissements. It's a massive opportunity and a legacy that Paris will want to concentrate on.
Now, I'm being told that Anne Hidalgo deployed a freestyle front crawl in her swim this morning. But Emmanuel Macron didn't join her. He was meant to. We're not going to find out whether maybe he can only doggy paddle. Is that a vile calumny on the president of France and not fit for the dignity of his office, etc., etc.? Why didn't he turn up? We'd have loved to have seen the president of France in a wetsuit and goggles.
It is a shame. It is a promise that he made quite some months ago, and it's a shame that he didn't join Anne Hidalgo. I think it probably says more about France's political situation at the moment as it does about the Olympics. But nonetheless, the Olympics are an important event for Paris and for France, and it would have been historic to see him there. So that is a shame.
Now, you did mention, Claudia, that a few weeks ago, this swim wouldn't have been possible, that the bacteria levels have been too high. So what's in place to stop those levels rising again before the start of the Games?
Yeah, so this is a 1.4 billion euro investment, and this is looking at preventing sewage leaks into the Seine, but they've also got these sort of giant underwater storage basins to contain overflows and have been upgrading the wastewater treatment plants. And all of these things are in place to act as a buffer for heavy rain spells and for continuing levels of bacteria. I mean, it's worth noting that just because Anne Hidalgo has managed to swim in the Seine this morning, that doesn't actually guarantee that it is safe for the athletes to be able to swim in it in a couple of weeks' time. I mean, it has very occasionally happened that the quality of water isn't strong enough for the triathlon, the swimming part of the triathlon to take place. I don't know if that's going to happen. We'll have to wait and see. But we'll have to hope that the infrastructure upgrades that they have put in place will act as enough of a buffer for this to be able to take place. But with heavy rain spells that we've been having over the past few weeks, it's unclear.
Yeah, sure, because I mean, as any surfer will tell you, when it rains, it's not a great idea to go in the water.
No, it's really not safe. So we'll have to wait and see if it's safe enough.
But is this something which isn't just meant to be for the Games? Is this meant to be, as you were talking about, a long-term legacy that we're going to turn Parisians into it's going to be like Zurich, is it, where everybody's having a dip in the river before work?
Absolutely. I mean, they're saying that by next summer, Parisians will be able to use these public swimming sort of facilities properly. So this summer it's just for the Olympics. But this is definitely something that the Olympic organisers have been looking to pull off for years. I mean, swimming in the Seine hasn't been a possibility for a century now. It's really a landmark moment. And Parisians have a very complicated relationship with the Seine, and it's what gives sort of the distinct identity to the city. The left bank and the right bank that we talk about, that comes from the Seine. So it's definitely an important moment, not just for the Olympics and for the legacy that leaves behind, but also the quality of life for Parisians in the city. How is that going to change post-Olympics? And the Seine is possibly the biggest part.
So this isn't going to be just lobbing yourself into the river from Paris Plage. It's going to be a bit more formally set out than that, is it?
Yeah, exactly. There'll be various different bathing establishments alongside the Seine in various different arrondissements. And yeah, I think it won't just be sort of a leisure activity, but we can maybe we see in Zurich people this commuting to work with swimming with your work attire on your back. Maybe in several years' time we might be able to see something like that in Paris. But
and are you committing to doing it yourself, Claudia?
Oh, I don't want to agree to stuff like that, but I would love to. I actually would love to. I mean, maybe in London we'll see the same thing in a few years' time. Who knows?
Excellent. One can only hope. Claudia Jacob, thank you very much for joining us on The Briefing. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Guy Delaunay. Now, Google and Amazon have long insisted that Project Nimbus was simply a cloud computing contract with the government of Israel. After employee protests in April, Google said that the project had no connection to highly sensitive, classified or military workloads relevant to weapons or intelligence services. The company sacked around 50 employees in the wake of the protests. But a new report in Wired magazine now claims there's a paper trail proving that the Israel Defence Forces have been central to Project Nimbus since its inception. Well, Caroline Haskins wrote that report and she joins us now from New York. Welcome to The Briefing, Caroline. For those of us who haven't been following this in detail, what is Project Nimbus supposed to be?
Hi, so Project Nimbus is a $1.2 billion cloud computing project between the government of Israel and on the corporate side, Google and Amazon. And the project involves building data centers and basically migrating a bunch of government information over into these new cloud computing systems in an effort to sort of modernize their systems and also providing sort of on-site services as necessary. That's sort of the short answer of it.
But there's always been this question of whether that would include military applications of this cloud computing service. And what is it that you've dug up that shows that the service is indeed being used as for military applications, despite, as we heard there, Google's statement otherwise?
Right. So a part of Project Nimbus is that it really extends across pretty much all of Israel's government agencies, but in spite of this, Google in particular has insisted publicly that the IDF, military agencies, intelligence agencies aren't a primary part of the contract. That it's not what the workloads are focused on, meaning the data workloads. But really looking back into the archives of both government contract documents, press releases, and even public statements that Israeli public officials, Amazon employees and Google employees have made both in Hebrew and in English show that there have been a lot of pretty public references to the fact that the IDF is an important part of Project Nimbus and that part of the cloud computing capacity is being dedicated to, sort of military, military workloads.
I'm struck though, Caroline, in your report that these aren't things that you've had to rely on a whistleblower to tell you about. These are things which are actually, if you like, hiding in plain sight, or not even hiding. So, for example, a statement provided by Israel's Ministry of Finance in 2022 to the Israeli online news outlet Mako said the relevant security bodies were partners of this project from its first day and are full partners still. And you've got another statement again from 2021, an audit report by the Israel State Comptroller, noting that the Ministry of Defense and the IDF are crucial parts of the team working on the tender, both in creating the requirements and in assessing the outcomes. So if all of this has been out there all this time, how can Google, with a straight face, insist that that's not what it is?
That's a good question. I don't exactly know the answer to that. I mean, I think that they've been able to, arguably instrumentalize the fact that a lot of these posts weren't in English, but a lot of the resistance from Google and Amazon employees have come from, English-speaking offices, from English-speaking regions. And, there's sort of a mix of both news coverage, documents, and public statements that are more recent and ones that are older. So, for instance, ones that were discussing the fact that the IDF actually helped select Google and Amazon as the companies that would be, sort of heading Project Nimbus. Some of those articles were a couple of years old. So I think probably a combination of things made it so that, I don't know, they were definitely publicly accessible. They were definitely searchable, but maybe not at the top of just a generic search, I guess.
To give us an idea of why and to what extent employees at Google and indeed Amazon have been upset about the connections between Project Nimbus and the Israeli military.
Yeah, so when details about the project became public in 2021, pretty soon after, you saw employees at both Google and Amazon sort of organizing and voicing resistance to the project. And this was sort of coming at the heels of resistance to work between especially Google and Amazon and Customs and Border Protection and ICE. This was in sort of 2019 at the height of sort of the family separation policy and a lot of crises that were happening at the U.S. Southern border. And even before that, Project Maven was a pretty significant area of employee activism at Google. So that was, at the time, possible contract between Google and the Department of Defense to develop AI-powered sort of targeting weapons for military purposes. So sort of at the heels of these like recent waves of employee activism, as details of this became public, people who were, willing to take a public stand against, sort of apartheid practices in Israel, and this was also coming at around the time that there was a sort of rise in violence in, talking pretty quickly, in Gaza. Between Israel and Gaza.
Then that's what's brought about the employee unrest. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Caroline. And I would recommend that if people want to get online or in print with Wired magazine, you can read all of Caroline's article there. Thanks again for joining us, Caroline Haskins. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And we're back with The Briefing here on Monocle Radio. And let's get a roundup now of some of the day's business stories with Ewan Potts from Bloomberg. Welcome back to The Briefing, Ewan. How's it going?
Hello, Guy. Very well, thanks.
And now, Ewan, let's see what investors have. Now, this is something we've been talking about in our family. Investors have been taking stock of what a Trump presidency might mean for markets. How much is already baked in, would you say?
Yeah, well, it's not just the political talk of the week. It is very much the talk for investors as well. They call it the Trump trade. with all the events of the past few weeks, markets are betting that a Trump presidency is more likely than not. So they've been weighing which companies, which sectors and which markets will do well out of 4 years of Donald Trump being in the White House. And it's been quite a week, really. The considerations for investors really are what it would mean in terms of policy. So a stronger dollar is talked about, tax cuts, perhaps looser fiscal policy, even looser than at the moment. Of course, the US already running a very large deficit, perhaps more inflation. Environmental regulations will perhaps be loosened. We know there'll be more drilling for oil and gas. And trade policy, also something very interesting for investors as well. Biden, I think it's fair to say, has been pretty hawkish on China, and we would expect President Trump to be
even more so.
Even more so, exactly. And happening over the last week has been a massive rotation. They call it an epic rotation from big cap stocks into small cap stocks in the markets. Now, this is partly because of expectations that the Fed is about to start cutting rates. Finally, inflation looks like it's licked, although, we can never be totally certain about that. But over the last 5 sessions, the small cap Russell 2000 index is up 12%. The wider S&P 500 is just up 1.5%, and tech stocks, the Nasdaq, have actually fallen over that period. So this is a real reversal of the pattern we've seen over the last couple of years. So a fascinating rotation into riskier, smaller companies.
Well, there we are. Riskier times indeed. And talking of tech, ASML, it's I presume we're talking about ASML if we're talking about the largest chip machine maker in the world, aren't we? Rather than somebody who's doing something for fish and chip shops or anything like that. But basically, if you want to make chips, you need the machinery of ASML. They're more or less the only game in town. Their sales have been booming, and yet their shares have been falling. What's going on?
Yeah, it's a fascinating company. It's actually the second most valuable company in Europe after Novo Nordisk, the obesity drug maker. But as you say, it is a company which really has a monopoly on the most advanced chip-making machines. It's a Dutch company, but it's been coming under a huge amount of pressure from the United States. They've just released their second quarter bookings number. They were up 54%, which is really quite a stellar number, better than the analysts were forecasting. But the shares are slumping today. It's all about worries for the future. Their projection for the current quarter was a little bit less than analysts were looking for. But also, there's a lot of concern about the political risk for ASML. The Biden administration is considering using its most severe trade restrictions available to companies, including ASML, if they continue to give China access to these advanced semiconductor making machines. Now, there are already restrictions on the most advanced ones, but it's understood that the US wants to ramp up these restrictions further. And also, ASML continue to service the machines in China as well, which there is some talk that the US is also unhappy with.
Choppy times for chips. Thanks very much for joining us, Ewan. That's Ewan Potts from Bloomberg. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Finally, on today's briefing, it's time to focus on Brazil with a roundup on what's happening there. Monocle's senior correspondent and resident Brazilian Fernando Augusto Pacheco is here in the studio. Nonetheless, we're starting with a bit of an airport roundup, Fernando, aren't we? As we were talking in the office about the worst European airport to transfer through, but you did a story a couple of years ago about the international airport in Rio, which, now I'm rubbish with that little A with the squiggly line over the top. Galeão.
Galeão, perfect.
There we go.
You did very well. And yes, so 2 years ago I wrote a story about the decadence of Galeão, because Galeão is the international airport of the city of Rio de Janeiro. So, of course, it was one of the busiest airports in the country. The problem with Galeão is the location is a little bit far from the city center. So the story I did is that suddenly it was becoming empty. There was a fall of 65% in the number of passengers. And the domestic airport in Rio, Santos Dumont, incredible location. It's one of the most beautiful airports in the world, in my opinion. You land and you see all the touristic attractions in Rio. It was becoming too popular. But the thing is, Santos Dumont, the domestic airport, is very small. So, everybody wants to go to Santos Dumont because it's easy, but the problem with that, Guy, that Galeão, of course, is the only international airport in Rio. So the city was becoming a little bit less connected. So the government had to intervene because the numbers were really crazy. I mean, every time you went to Galeão in the last 2 years was empty. And it was very weird. So because then...
And that sounds attractive in its own way.
Well, it is attractive, but for example, if you are a foreigner wanting to visit Brazil,
sure. I mean, it's basically you've just come back from Tokyo, so it's the Narita Haneda situation, isn't it?
Exactly.
You'd much rather fly in and out of Haneda than you would Narita, and I think Tokyo eventually recognised that, and they renovated Haneda so it could take many more international flights. Now, is there any sign of Rio being able to do something similar?
So this is what happened actually earlier this year. So the government intervened. So, but the way they did it, they restricted the numbers at the domestic airport. So they almost kind of forced the numbers at Galeão to improve it again. So the numbers did rise. So Galeão now is the 4th busiest airport in Brazil in the latest ranking. It climbed for number 10. But as I said, the only reason for it, I'm not sure if it was improvements necessarily in the airport. It's just that the government forced airlines to actually change their routes. I'm not sure if the passengers will be very happy because every time I go to Rio, I know sometimes it's even a little bit more expensive, but I prefer to go via the domestic one. It's so much more practical.
And the flight
beautiful.
might be more expensive, but it's cheaper to get into the city.
Exactly. So there's a lot of things to look into it in the story here.
I do like the fact that is it the official title of Galeão Airport is Tom Jobim?
Yes.
That's fabulous. I mean, as somebody whose home city airport is called John Lennon, I approve.
It's very chic.
Yeah.
Tom Jobim, of course, is one of our main musicians, one of the founders of Bossa Nova. Of course, he composed As All the Girl from Ipanema. I mean, he's a legend.
He is indeed a legend. So, let's see, what else have we got other than these airport things that we've been talking about, Fernando?
Very briefly here, let's talk about the airport of the city of Porto Alegre in the southern Brazil. I was here on the briefing almost 2 months ago. They had terrible floods. I mean, it was the worst floods ever in the city and in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. So the airport, which is a very important airport for southern Brazil, had to be closed for 2 months. So again, if you wanted to go to Porto Alegre, you had to go via other states or you had to drive. So it was it really impacted in the economy. But good news, since Monday, the airport reopened partially. The ticket fares are still very expensive. I think by October, it will be slightly better according to the statistics. But nevertheless, most of the shops are reopened in the airport. So it's good news for the state that really, really suffered.
Is this something which is now becoming more regular, the extreme weather events? Because, I mean, on a much, much smaller scale, Fernando, we had an incident in Slovenia twice in the space of a month. Maribor Airport was put out of action by heavy rain, I mean torrential rain, and the infrastructure of the airport itself has been damaged. So, I mean, Brazil, how much is that experiencing, where it's a much larger country, air travel is essential both domestically as well as internationally. How is it being able to deal with the extreme weather events?
It's getting worse and worse, and I think especially in that region of Brazil. I mean, the meteorologists will explain this better, but it's a very complicated region because it's raining more and more. So although it was the worst ever, people are saying that this will become more often. So I wonder if they'll have to change the infrastructure as well of the airport, because I think a city like Porto Alegre needs an airport. It can't have 2 months without a proper airport working, in my opinion.
Now, it was said, was it Scott Fitzgerald who said there are no second acts in American lives, or have I got that quotation completely wrong? But anyway, Alberto Fujimori is trying to prove, I don't know, what is this now, a fifth act?
Wow.
He won't go away. The former Peruvian president, he's now 85 years old, which is several years older than Joe Biden, let's note, and he is planning to run for president again in 2026. So that's 2 years hence, when he'll be 87.
I mean, that's a crazy story. And I wonder if he is indeed a candidate, what's the percentage? I mean, how many Peruvians would vote for him? Because let's put things into context. Alberto Fujimori, he was the president between 1990 and 2000, but it was a very authoritarian regime. In fact, he just left prison for human rights abuses. He was released late last year. So, very much of a divisive figure and, in my opinion, a despicable figure as well. But nevertheless, there is a part of Peru that likes Alberto Fujimori in a way, and his daughter as well, Keiko Fujimori. She's the one who announced that her father will try, maybe because she was not lucky herself. She tried 3 times. It didn't really work out for her, and now she's saying, well, let's see if my dad, who was the president, will manage. But, it's funny, we're talking about Joe Biden. Yes, I mean, Alberto Fujimori will be much, much older. So I think Joe Biden looks sprightly compared to him.
Absolutely extraordinary. And I can confirm I did get that literary quotation right. It was Scott Fitzgerald, thank goodness. The heat of the day has not got to me after all, Fernando. Thanks very much for joining us, as always, on The Briefing. That's Fernando Augusto Pacheco. And that indeed is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Tom Webb, and our researcher was Gunnar Gronlid. Sana Jumani as well was our researcher, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow. I'm Guy Delaunay. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.